Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the gilded nightmare that was life in an imperial harem. You know, those supposed pleasure palaces that Hollywood sold you on? Yeah, we're about to destroy that fantasy faster than a Roman legion destroys a barbarian village. So before we shatter your romantic delusions, hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy having your historical misconceptions brutally corrected. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because misery loves company and we're all in this together. Maybe grab some tea, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into bureaucratic insanity that makes modern government red tape look like a children's game. So you think being chosen for an emperor's harem was winning the ancient world's lottery? Precious. Really like thinking a tax audit is a spa day. Tonight we're exploring the strange bedroom rules of imperial harems you definitely didn't know about. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at silk curtains the same way again. These weren't pleasure palaces. They were maximum security prisons where the bars were made of protocol and every intimate moment required a committee meeting to approve. So you think you know what luxury looks like. You think being chosen for an imperial harem was like winning the ancient world's lottery. All silk sheets and grapes fed by beautiful servants. Let me disabuse you of that romantic notion right now. The imperial harem wasn't a pleasure palace. It was a maximum security prison where the bars were made of protocol. The guards were eunuchs with trust issues, and every single rule about intimacy was designed by people who clearly had never experienced it themselves. First things first, forget everything Hollywood taught you about harems. This wasn't some exotic fantasy where sultry women lounged around in diaphanous veils waiting for their turn with the emperor. No, this was a bureaucratic nightmare where every breath you took was regulated, every glance was monitored, and every bodily function required written permission from at least 3 different officials. Let's start with the most basic rule that would make your modern mind explode. You couldn't just walk into the emperor's bedroom. You couldn't even think about walking into his bedroom without going through a process so complicated it made tax forms look like children's picture books. Want to spend a night with the most powerful man in the empire? Great. First, you had to be selected by the mistress of the bedchamber, a woman whose job description included professional intimacy scheduler and destroyer of romantic spontaneity. But selection was just the beginning. Once chosen, you entered what can only be described as a decontamination process that would make a nuclear facility jealous. You were bathed not once, not twice, but 7 times. 7. Each bath had its own specific purpose, its own special soap, and its own particular way you had to scrub. The first bath removed the impurities of the outside world. The second bath removed any lingering traces of your former life. By the 7th bath, they were probably just making sure you hadn't somehow smuggled in a concealed weapon between your toes. And speaking of weapons, every inch of your body was inspected. Not by the emperor, mind you, but by a team of professional body inspectors whose job it was to ensure you weren't carrying anything that could harm His Imperial Majesty. This included but was not limited to knives, poison needles, hairpins longer than 2 inches, jewelry with sharp edges, belt buckles, shoe clasps, and anything that could conceivably be used to strangle someone. They were so thorough that they probably checked your dental work to make sure you hadn't carved your molars into tiny daggers. Once you passed the weapon inspection, you moved on to the clothing ceremony. You couldn't wear your own clothes to see the emperor. That would be absurd. Instead, you were dressed in specially designated imperial bedchamber attire, which consisted of exactly 3 items: a silk robe that had been blessed by 7 different priests, undergarments that had been sewn by virgin seamstresses using thread spun during a full moon, and slippers that were so soft they couldn't possibly be used to kick anyone. The robe, by the way, had no fastenings, no buttons, no ties, no clasps. It was held together entirely by hope and the expectation that you wouldn't make any sudden movements. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. You couldn't speak to the emperor unless he spoke to you first. And when he did speak to you, you couldn't respond directly. You had to address all your responses to the ornate carpet at his feet, while genuflecting in a position that can best be described as apologetic pretzel. Eye contact was forbidden unless specifically requested, and even then, You were only allowed to look at his forehead, never directly into his eyes. Looking into the emperor's eyes was considered an act of spiritual aggression that could result in anything from immediate banishment to creative execution. The bedroom itself was a masterpiece of paranoid interior design. The bed was positioned in the exact center of the room, surrounded by a circle of guards who stood with their backs turned and their ears plugged with specially crafted wax. Because privacy, you see, was a luxury reserved for people who weren't trying to produce the next heir to the throne. Every imperial bedroom encounter was conducted under the watchful gaze of a dozen men, whose job it was to simultaneously protect the emperor and pretend they couldn't hear what was happening 3 feet behind them. Temperature control in the bedroom was another adventure and absurdity. The room had to be kept at exactly 72 degrees. Not 71, not 73, but exactly 72. This required a team of temperature specialists who took hourly measurements using instruments that were probably more precise than most modern thermostats. If the temperature fluctuated by even half a degree, braziers were lit or extinguished with the precision of a military operation. God forbid the emperor should experience thermal discomfort while attempting to secure the dynasty's future. The bed itself deserves its own chapter in the annals of overwrought luxury. It wasn't just a bed. It was a platform of political significance covered in silk sheets that cost more than most people's houses. These sheets were changed after every use and then burned in a ceremonial fire, because apparently the imperial DNA was too precious to risk ending up at a medieval laundromat. The mattress was stuffed with the down of exactly 1,000 geese that had lived lives of pampered luxury before being sacrificed for the emperor's comfort. Each pillow was filled with rose petals that had been picked at dawn by women who had fasted for 3 days to ensure their hands were spiritually pure. But let's talk about timing, because in the Imperial harem, timing wasn't just important, it was everything. You couldn't visit the emperor during certain phases of the moon, on days ending in numbers divisible by 3, during thunderstorms, or within 24 hours of him having eaten garlic. The court astrologers maintained detailed charts tracking the emperor's optimal fertility windows, cross-referenced with lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and the migration patterns of various birds, because apparently, even imperial procreation required celestial approval. If you were lucky enough to be selected for an imperial encounter, you were given exactly 90 minutes. This wasn't negotiable. At the 89-minute mark, a gentle chime would sound, giving you a 1-minute warning to wrap things up. At exactly 90 minutes, regardless of what was happening, a team of attendants would enter the room and escort you out. There was no overtime in the imperial bedroom, no extended sessions for good performance, no encore presentations. The emperor's schedule was more tightly managed than a modern CEO's, and intimacy was just another appointment squeezed between military briefings and tax assessments. After your 90 minutes of imperial attention, you entered what can only be called the post-encounter protocol. You were immediately escorted to a special chamber where you underwent another series of baths, this time designed to preserve any potential imperial offspring, while simultaneously removing any trace of the encounter from your person. You were then required to write a detailed report of the experience, which was filed away in imperial archives and probably reviewed by bureaucrats whose job it was to analyze the emperor's bedroom performance for political implications. For the next 30 days, you were kept in isolation in a luxury apartment that was basically a golden cage. You couldn't leave, couldn't receive visitors, and couldn't communicate with anyone except the specially trained midwives who monitored your health for signs of pregnancy. Your food was prepared by imperial chefs who had taken vows of silence, ensuring that no details of your confinement could leak to potential political rivals. If, after 30 days, you showed no signs of pregnancy, you were returned to the general harem population with a small pension and the eternal knowledge that you had failed in your primary imperial duty. But if you were pregnant, congratulations! Your life had just become infinitely more complicated. Pregnant concubines were moved to special quarters that made maximum security prisons look like vacation resorts. Every aspect of your pregnancy was monitored, documented, and analyzed by teams of imperial physicians whose medical degrees apparently included advanced courses in oppressive surveillance techniques. Your diet was planned down to the individual grape. Your exercise regimen was choreographed like a ballet, and your emotional state was managed by a team of court psychologists who had clearly read too many ancient texts about the correlation between maternal mood and imperial succession. The delivery room was another marvel of paranoid preparation. The walls were lined with armed guards whose job it was to ensure that no one could switch babies, poison the newborn, or somehow smuggle out imperial DNA for nefarious purposes. The midwives were selected not just for their medical skills, but for their ability to maintain state secrets under torture. Because apparently, the details of imperial childbirth were classified information that could threaten national security if it fell into the wrong hands. And speaking of babies, if you gave birth to a son, you had just won the ancient world's most dangerous lottery. Male children were immediately tested for imperial worthiness through a series of examinations that included checking their reflexes, measuring their cry volume, and apparently reading their fortune through the pattern of their newborn hair growth. If your son passed these tests, you were elevated to the status of imperial mother, which came with its own set of rules so complex they required their own dedicated bureaucracy to manage. Imperial mothers lived in apartments that were luxurious prisons, surrounded by every comfort except freedom. You couldn't leave without permission, couldn't speak to unauthorized individuals, and couldn't raise your own child without supervision from imperial tutors who began educational programming before the infant could focus their eyes. Your son belonged to the empire now, and you were just the biological vessel who had delivered him. If you gave birth to a daughter, the situation was only marginally less complicated. Imperial daughters were valuable political assets who would eventually be married off to foreign dignitaries or domestic allies to cement treaties and alliances. From birth, they were educated in languages, diplomacy, and the fine art of looking interested while their future husbands discussed military strategy. Your daughter would be raised by teams of tutors, governesses, and cultural specialists whose job it was to transform her into the perfect political pawn. But let's get back to the bedroom rules, because we've only scratched the surface of the absurdity. Did you know that certain positions were forbidden? Not for moral reasons, but because court physicians had determined they were less likely to result in male offspring. The Imperial Manual of Approved Intimate Positions was a document so detailed it made modern anatomy textbooks look like children's coloring books. Each position had been scientifically analyzed for its potential to produce the desired gender of heir, and deviation from approved techniques was considered a form of treason against the dynasty's future. The emperor's own preparation for these encounters was equally ridiculous. He underwent his own bathing ceremony, though his was only 5 baths instead of 7, because apparently imperial masculinity required fewer purification rituals. He was dressed in specially blessed robes that had been woven by monks who had taken vows of celibacy, because the irony was completely lost on everyone involved. His diet was regulated for 48 hours before any scheduled encounter, with certain foods forbidden because they might affect his performance, and others required because they were believed to enhance his virility. But here's the part that would make your modern mind completely explode. The emperor wasn't allowed to enjoy himself too much. Court physicians had determined that excessive pleasure might drain his imperial essence, reducing his ability to produce quality offspring. So even the most powerful man in the empire had to maintain a certain level of detached professionalism during what should have been his most intimate moments. Imagine trying to concentrate on dynasty building while simultaneously worrying about whether you're having too much fun. The scheduling of these encounters was managed by a dedicated department of imperial intimacy coordinators, whose job it was to balance the emperor's personal desires with political necessities, astrological requirements, and the complex web of harem politics. Different concubines represented different political alliances, and the frequency of imperial visits was a carefully calculated political statement. Spend too much time with one woman, and you risked offending the political faction she represented. Neglect another, and you might find yourself dealing with a diplomatic incident that could threaten trade relationships. And then there were the dietary restrictions. Oh, the dietary restrictions. Concubines were forbidden from eating garlic, onions, or anything else that might create offensive breath during an Imperial encounter. They couldn't consume alcohol because that might impair their fertility. They couldn't eat certain spices that were believed to heat the blood and potentially harm a developing pregnancy. Their meals were prepared by specialized chefs who had memorized lists of approved ingredients longer than most modern grocery store catalogs. But it wasn't just about what you couldn't eat. There were foods you had to eat, whether you liked them or not. Royal physicians had determined that certain combinations of herbs and vegetables enhanced fertility, so every meal included mandatory portions of what can best be described as medicinal salad. These fertility foods tasted exactly as appetizing as you'd expect from something designed by people who prioritized reproductive efficiency over culinary pleasure. Personal hygiene was another area where the rules reached levels of absurdity that would make modern germaphobes look reasonable. Concubines had to bathe daily using water that had been blessed by priests, heated to exact temperatures, and infused with specific herbs that changed depending on the phase of the moon. They couldn't use regular soap, only specially formulated cleaning compounds that had been tested by court alchemists for their potential effects on imperial offspring. Hair care was a particular obsession. Your hair had to be washed with water from sacred springs, combed with brushes made from specific types of wood, and styled according to patterns that had been approved by imperial aestheticians. Certain hairstyles were forbidden during certain seasons. Others were required during specific ceremonies, and all of them had to be recreated exactly each time or risk accusations of disrespecting imperial tradition. Nail care was equally ridiculous. Fingernails had to be kept at precisely regulated lengths, filed to approved shapes, and polished with substances that had been blessed by religious authorities. The thought of a hangnail during an imperial encounter was apparently so horrifying that teams of specialized manicurists were employed full time to ensure that no concubine's fingernails could possibly scratch, puncture, or otherwise harm the emperor during intimate moments. Even sleep was regulated. Concubines had to sleep on beds oriented in specific directions, using pillows filled with herbs that promoted fertility dreams. They couldn't sleep on their stomachs, because that might compress internal organs important for reproduction. They couldn't sleep too deeply, because they needed to be alert for potential summons at any hour. They couldn't sleep too lightly, because that might indicate nervous anxiety that could affect their ability to conceive. Exercise was mandatory, but heavily regulated. Too much exercise might make you too muscular, which was considered unfeminine. Too little exercise might make you unhealthy, which could affect your fertility. The approved exercise regimen consisted of specific stretches, breathing exercises, and dance movements that had been designed to maintain optimal reproductive health, while preserving the soft, delicate appearance that imperial preferences demanded. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging rule was the prohibition on emotional attachment. You were expected to feel honored by imperial attention, grateful for the opportunity to serve the dynasty, and completely devoted to the emperor's well-being. But you couldn't love him. Love implied a personal relationship, and personal relationships with the emperor were considered a threat to imperial objectivity. You were a political asset, a reproductive resource, and a diplomatic tool. But you were definitely not supposed to be a person with feelings. This emotional detachment was enforced through a system of psychological monitoring that would make modern surveillance states look amateur. Court observers watched for signs of inappropriate emotional investment, from lingering gazes to changes in eating patterns that might indicate lovesickness. Women who showed signs of genuine affection for the emperor were either removed from the harem entirely or subjected to emotional correction. Programs that involved isolation, meditation, and intensive counseling designed to redirect their feelings toward more appropriate targets. The consequences for breaking any of these rules ranged from mild correction to creative execution, depending on which rule you broke and how spectacularly you broke it. Minor infractions like incorrect posture or improper hair arrangement might result in temporary loss of privileges or additional training sessions with protocol instructors. Major violations like speaking out of turn or showing inappropriate emotion could lead to banishment, imprisonment, or death. But here's the truly insane part. None of these rules were secret. They were all written down in exhaustive detail in official manuals that were required reading for anyone entering the harem. New concubines spent months memorizing protocols, practicing proper behavior, and being tested on their knowledge of imperial bedroom etiquette. There were oral examinations, written tests, and practical demonstrations where experienced concubines would critique your technique for approaching the imperial presence with appropriate deference. The training process was overseen by retired concubines who had successfully navigated the system and lived to tell about it. These instructors were like drill sergeants of intimacy, screaming corrections at women who couldn't properly execute the 17-step process for approaching an imperial bed, or who failed to maintain the exact angle of head bow required when addressing carpet fibers. And just when you thought you had mastered all the rules, they would change. Imperial preferences evolved, new political alliances required different protocols, and court physicians would discover new theories about fertility optimization that demanded completely revised procedures. What was required behavior 1 month might be forbidden the next, and staying current with protocol updates was a full-time job that required constant vigilance and excellent memory skills. The clothing rules alone required their own dedicated staff to manage. Different types of imperial encounters required different outfits, and the distinctions were so subtle that specialized wardrobe consultants were employed to ensure that no one accidentally wore ceremonial encounter attire to a casual imperial visit, or vice versa. The wrong shade of silk could be interpreted as a political statement, the wrong jewelry could suggest inappropriate allegiances, and the wrong perfume could offend imperial sensibilities in ways that might affect international relations. Speaking of perfume, the approved scent list was updated monthly based on the emperor's changing preferences, seasonal considerations, and astrological recommendations. Wearing unauthorized fragrances was considered a form of assault on imperial senses, punishable by immediate removal from the harem and possible exile. The perfume preparation process involved teams of specialized alchemists who created custom blends using ingredients sourced from across the empire and mixed according to formulas that were more closely guarded than military secrets. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of harem life was the constant competition. You weren't just competing for imperial attention. You were competing in a system designed to pit women against each other while maintaining the facade of harmonious cooperation. Every interaction with other concubines was potentially politically significant. Every friendship could be interpreted as a conspiracy, and every display of kindness might be seen as strategic manipulation. The hierarchy within the harem was more complex than the imperial bureaucracy, with ranks, titles, and privileges that changed based on factors including, but not limited to, frequency of imperial visits, success in producing offspring, political connections of your family, personal relationships with influential eunuchs, and your ability to navigate the social dynamics without making enemies who could destroy your career through strategic rumors. Climbing the harem hierarchy required skills that combined diplomacy, psychology, and game theory in ways that would challenge modern political strategists. You had to be friendly enough to avoid making enemies, but not so friendly that you appeared to be plotting. You had to be beautiful enough to attract imperial attention, but not so beautiful that you threatened more established concubines. You had to be intelligent enough to contribute to conversations, but not so intelligent that you appeared to challenge imperial authority. And through all of this, you had to maintain the pretense that you were living a life of unparalleled luxury and privilege. Complaining about harem life was not just discouraged, it was considered treason. You were supposed to be grateful for the honor of serving the empire through your reproductive potential, thankful for the opportunity to contribute to the dynasty's future, and completely satisfied with a life that offered every material comfort except freedom, privacy, or genuine human connection. The medical monitoring was perhaps the most invasive aspect of harem life. Court physicians examined concubines monthly to assess their fertility, monitor their health, and ensure they were maintaining optimal reproductive condition. These examinations were conducted by teams of specialists whose medical expertise was combined with political awareness. Because your health status wasn't just personal information, It was state intelligence that could affect diplomatic relationships and succession planning. Birth control was simultaneously forbidden and mandatory, depending on circumstances that changed according to imperial mood and political necessity. When the emperor wanted children, any attempt to prevent pregnancy was considered treason. When political circumstances made new heirs inconvenient, failure to prevent pregnancy could result in charges of political sabotage. Navigating these contradictory demands required constant communication with court physicians and political advisors, who somehow expected you to control biological processes through sheer force of will and political awareness. The punishment system for rule violations was designed by people who clearly understood that physical pain was temporary, but psychological damage could last forever. Most infractions were punished through social isolation, privilege removal, or forced participation in additional training programs that were designed to be as humiliating as they were educational. The goal wasn't just to correct behavior, it was to reinforce your position in the hierarchy and remind you that your entire existence depended on imperial mercy and bureaucratic approval. But the most psychologically damaging punishment was being ignored. In a system where imperial attention was the ultimate currency, being deliberately overlooked was worse than any physical consequence. Concubines who fell out of favor found themselves gradually erased from harem life, excluded from activities, ignored by staff, and eventually forgotten entirely until they were quietly relocated to remote imperial properties, where they lived comfortable but invisible lives as forgotten footnotes in dynastic history. The record-keeping around all of this was meticulous to the point of obsession. Every imperial encounter was documented, every pregnancy was tracked, every birth was analyzed, and every child was monitored throughout their development. These records were maintained by dedicated scribes whose job it was to create detailed reports that tracked patterns in imperial fertility, identified optimal timing for future encounters, and provided data that court statisticians used to make predictions about dynastic stability. But perhaps the most surreal aspect of harem life was how normal it all seemed to the people living it. Women who had spent years navigating these systems developed the ability to discuss the most absurd regulations with the same matter, a fact tone they might use to talk about weather patterns. The rules became so internalized that questioning them seemed as ridiculous as questioning gravity or sunrise schedules. New arrivals to the harem were often shocked by the complexity of the system, but veteran concubines had developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to find meaning and satisfaction within the constraints. They created informal social networks, developed hobbies that were permitted within the regulations, and built relationships with staff members who could provide small favors and emotional support within the boundaries of what was officially allowed. The economic aspects of harem life were equally complex. Concubines received allowances that were calculated based on their rank, their success in producing offspring, and their length of service. These allowances could be used to purchase approved luxury items, commission custom clothing within regulatory guidelines, and hire personal servants whose employment had to be approved through official channels and whose loyalty was constantly monitored by security personnel. But money in the harem was more than just currency. It was a tool of political control. Your spending patterns were analyzed for signs of political affiliation. Unusual purchases were investigated for potential security implications, and your financial relationships with other concubines were monitored for evidence of conspiracy or inappropriate alliance building. Even generosity was suspicious, because unexpected gifts could indicate attempts to build political coalitions or curry favor for future schemes. The educational requirements for harem life extended far beyond bedroom etiquette into areas that covered everything from elementary diplomacy to advanced economics. Concubines were expected to understand the political implications of their actions, the economic consequences of their choices, and the social ramifications of their relationships. They attended regular seminars on current events, received briefings on imperial policy changes, and were tested on their knowledge of international relations as they might affect their role in diplomatic entertaining. Language requirements were particularly demanding. Every concubine had to speak at least 3 languages fluently, understand the basics of several more, and be able to conduct conversations on topics ranging from agricultural policy to military strategy without revealing state secrets or expressing opinions that might be interpreted as criticism of imperial decisions. Language lessons were mandatory, conversation practice was monitored, and linguistic mistakes could have political consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. Cultural education was equally comprehensive. You had to understand the religious traditions of every major group within the empire, the historical significance of various festivals and ceremonies, and the proper protocols for interacting with foreign dignitaries whose cultural backgrounds might require completely different approaches to courtesy and respect. Cultural mistakes weren't just social embarrassments, they were potential diplomatic incidents that could affect trade relationships and military alliances. The artistic requirements were perhaps the most personally fulfilling aspect of harem education. Every concubine was required to master at least one form of artistic expression, from music and poetry to painting and dance. These skills were seen as essential for entertaining imperial guests, contributing to court cultural life, and providing appropriate leisure activities that could be pursued within the constraints of harem security requirements. But even artistic expression was regulated. Musical compositions had to be approved by court censors who analyzed lyrics for potential political content. Poetry was reviewed for hidden messages that might be interpreted as criticism or conspiracy. Paintings were examined for symbolic content that could be construed as subversive. And dance performances were choreographed according to standards that maintained appropriate levels of aesthetic appeal, while avoiding movements that might be considered overly provocative or politically suggestive. The library access was both a privilege and a form of surveillance. Concubines could request books on approved topics, but their reading habits were monitored and analyzed for signs of intellectual interests that might indicate political leanings or personal ambitions that could conflict with their role in the harem system. Reading materials were carefully selected to provide education and entertainment, while avoiding content that might inspire inappropriate thoughts about freedom, independence, or alternative ways of organizing society. Physical fitness requirements were based on imperial preferences that changed according to fashion trends, political alliances with foreign cultures, and medical theories about optimal reproductive health. Exercise regimens were designed by specialists who combined knowledge of human physiology with political awareness of current imperial taste in feminine appearance and diplomatic considerations about representing the empire's values to foreign visitors. The meal planning process involved teams of nutritionists, political advisors, and cultural specialists who created menu plans that balanced reproductive health requirements with diplomatic considerations and imperial preferences that might change without notice. Dietary restrictions weren't just about health, they were about political symbolism, religious observance, and cultural messaging that reflected imperial values and international relationships. Personal relationships within the harem were subject to regulations that would make modern human resources departments look permissive. Friendships had to be reported and analyzed for potential political implications. Romantic relationships between concubines were forbidden not for moral reasons, but because they could create emotional loyalties that might conflict with devotion to imperial service. Even casual conversations were monitored for content that might indicate inappropriate political interests or personal ambitions that could threaten harem stability. The religious requirements were complex enough to require dedicated theological advisors who helped concubines navigate the spiritual obligations associated with their role in imperial succession planning. They were expected to pray for imperial health, participate in fertility rituals, and maintain spiritual practices that were believed to enhance their reproductive potential while demonstrating appropriate devotion to religious traditions that legitimized imperial authority. But perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of harem life was the relationship with time itself. Your entire existence was structured around waiting. Waiting for imperial summons, waiting to discover if you were pregnant, waiting to see if your children would survive infancy, waiting for political changes that might affect your status, and ultimately waiting for the day when age would remove you from active service and relocate you to retirement facilities where former concubines lived comfortable but irrelevant lives as pensioners of imperial gratitude. The aging process in the harem was managed through carefully regulated beauty maintenance programs that combined cosmetic procedures with psychological counseling, designed to help women accept their changing role from active concubines to elder advisors and instructors for newer arrivals. The transition was gradual and dignified, but it was also inevitable and irreversible, marking the end of any possibility for significant political influence or personal agency within the imperial system. Retirement from active harem service came with benefits that included comfortable housing, regular allowances, and access to imperial medical care, but it also meant acceptance of complete irrelevance to the political processes that had defined your entire adult existence. Former concubines became living museums of imperial tradition, consulted for their knowledge of protocol and precedent, but excluded from any decision, making processes that might affect current harem operations or imperial policy. The children produced through this system grew up understanding that they were political assets first and human beings second. Sons were potential heirs, whose every action was analysed for signs of leadership potential or character flaws that might affect their suitability for imperial succession. Daughters were future diplomatic tools whose marriages would be arranged to cement political alliances and strengthen imperial relationships with foreign powers or domestic political factions. But despite all the regulations, restrictions, and psychological pressures, the system somehow functioned for centuries, producing heirs, maintaining political stability, and creating a culture that combined extreme luxury with complete surveillance in ways that seemed both absurd and inevitable. The women who lived within these constraints developed remarkable resilience, creativity, and diplomatic skills that allowed them to find meaning and satisfaction within circumstances that would challenge the psychological stability of anyone unprepared for the experience. And that, ultimately, was the most remarkable aspect of imperial harem life, not the absurdity of the regulations or the invasiveness of the monitoring, but the human capacity to adapt, survive, and even thrive within systems designed to reduce individual human beings to their most basic biological and political functions. These women created lives of dignity, purpose, and even happiness within constraints that seemed designed to make such achievements impossible, demonstrating that human resilience can find ways to flourish even in the most restrictive and dehumanizing circumstances imaginable. The legacy of these systems extended far beyond the imperial palaces where they operated, influencing concepts of power, sexuality, and political organization that affected societies across centuries and continents, creating cultural patterns that persisted long after the empires that created them had vanished into historical memory, leaving behind only records of their elaborate rules and the remarkable stories of the people who lived their entire lives within the boundaries of regulations that seem almost impossible to believe, yet were documented in such exhaustive detail that their reality cannot be questioned, only marveled at for their complexity and their creators' complete confidence that such systems were not only necessary, but reasonable responses to the challenges of maintaining political stability and dynastic continuity in societies where power was absolute and personal relationships were too dangerous to be left to chance, emotion, or individual choice. The seasonal variations in harem protocols added yet another layer of complexity that would make modern event planners weep with frustration. Spring required different clothing fabrics because court physicians believed that certain textiles could interfere with natural fertility cycles enhanced by warming weather. Summer protocols included mandatory afternoon rest periods during the hottest hours, not for comfort, but because excessive heat was thought to damage reproductive organs in ways that could affect future imperial offspring. Autumn brought dietary changes designed to prepare bodies for winter conception attempts, while winter protocols included additional heating requirements and modified bathing schedules that took into account seasonal depression theories developed by court psychologists. The astrological consultations weren't just occasional ceremonies, they were daily requirements that affected everything from meal timing to sleep positions. Court astrologers maintained detailed charts for each concubine that tracked planetary influences on their individual fertility cycles, optimal conception windows, and periods when imperial encounters should be avoided due to unfavorable stellar alignments. These astrological requirements meant that your love life was literally governed by the movement of celestial bodies, with Mars retrograde potentially cancelling scheduled imperial visits and lunar eclipses requiring emergency protocol adjustments. Weather monitoring was another obsession that affected harem operations in ways that seemed designed by people who had never experienced a normal relationship. Thunderstorms required all concubines to remain in interior rooms because lightning was believed to affect female reproductive systems. Heavy rain meant modified protocols for everything from bathing schedules to meal preparation. High winds required additional security measures because court advisors worried that atmospheric pressure changes might make concubines more emotionally volatile and therefore potentially dangerous to imperial safety. The communication protocols within the harem were so complex they required specialized training just to understand the approved methods for requesting basic necessities. Want to ask for extra blankets? You couldn't just tell a servant. You had to submit a written request through your designated attendant, who forwarded it to the appropriate department head, who reviewed it for potential security implications before approving or denying based on factors that included your current standing in the hierarchy, recent behavior evaluations, and whether additional blankets might somehow be used for unauthorized purposes. The gift-giving regulations were particularly insane because they governed both receiving presents from the emperor and exchanging items with other concubines. Imperial gifts came with detailed instruction manuals explaining proper appreciation protocols, required thank you procedures, and appropriate ways to display or use the items without violating various cultural or religious taboos. Gifts between concubines were limited to pre-approved items from authorized lists, required documentation explaining the reason for the exchange, and were subject to security inspections to ensure they weren't being used to pass secret messages or build unauthorized political alliances. Musical performances in the harem weren't just entertainment, they were political theatre subject to regulations that covered everything from approved instruments to forbidden musical scales that might be interpreted as coded criticism of imperial policies. Singing required voice training that included not just technique, but also political education about lyrics that were acceptable, themes that should be avoided, and how to modify traditional songs to remove any content that might be construed as subversive or inappropriate for the imperial court environment. The laundry procedures deserve special mention because they reveal the paranoid attention to detail that characterized every aspect of harem life. Clothing couldn't just be washed. It had to be processed through security protocols that ensured no unauthorized substances had been introduced during cleaning. Garments were sorted by owner, political significance, and potential security risk before being cleaned with approved detergents, dried according to specific schedules, and inspected for damage that might indicate sabotage attempts or coded messages hidden in fabric alterations. Personal correspondence was theoretically allowed, but practically impossible due to regulations that required every letter to be written in approved languages, reviewed by censors for political content, copied for imperial archives, and delivered through official channels that could take weeks or months to process simple messages. The end result was that most concubines stopped trying to maintain relationships with family or friends outside the palace, gradually becoming isolated in a luxury bubble that provided every physical comfort while systematically severing all emotional connections to the outside world. The entertainment schedule was managed like a military operation, with different types of performances scheduled according to imperial mood assessments, political calendar requirements, and astrological recommendations that determined when various forms of cultural activity would be most beneficial for harem morale and imperial satisfaction. Comedy performances were subject to script approval that ensured jokes didn't inadvertently mock imperial policies or social systems, while dramatic presentations required political review to confirm that plots didn't contain themes that might be interpreted as commentary on dynastic succession or imperial decision-making processes. Holiday celebrations within the harem combined religious observance with political demonstration in ways that transformed every festival into a complex diplomatic exercise. Religious holidays required participation in ceremonies that demonstrated appropriate devotion, while avoiding any expressions of spiritual conviction that might conflict with imperial religious policies. Political anniversaries demanded displays of patriotic enthusiasm that were choreographed, rehearsed, and performed under the supervision of officials who monitored facial expressions, vocal enthusiasm, and body language for signs of insufficient loyalty or inappropriate emotional response. The healthcare system in the harem was simultaneously the most advanced and most invasive medical care available in the ancient world. Court physicians provided treatments that combined cutting-edge medical knowledge with political awareness that every health decision could have implications for imperial succession planning. Illness wasn't just a personal medical issue, it was a potential threat to dynastic stability that required careful management to prevent panic, maintain confidence in the harem system, and ensure that any medical problems couldn't be exploited by political enemies seeking to undermine imperial authority. Pregnancy care in the harem elevated medical paranoia to levels that would challenge modern conspiracy theorists. Expectant mothers were monitored constantly by teams of specialists who tracked everything from fetal movement patterns to maternal dream content, because court physicians believed that prenatal experiences could affect the political loyalties and character traits of future imperial heirs. Diet during pregnancy was micromanaged to include specific nutrients that were thought to enhance intelligence, courage, and leadership potential while avoiding substances that might produce offspring with undesirable personality characteristics. The birthing process was conducted with security measures that treated every delivery as a potential national security event. The delivery room was guarded like a military installation, with multiple layers of security designed to prevent infant substitution, poison attempts, or information leaks that might compromise imperial succession planning. Witnesses to imperial births were selected for their political reliability and sworn to secrecy about details that were considered state secrets, potentially valuable to foreign intelligence services or domestic political rivals. Child care in the harem involved teams of specialists whose qualifications included not just knowledge of infant development, but also political education about raising children who would serve imperial interests, rather than developing independent personalities that might threaten dynastic stability. Imperial children were educated from birth about their role in the political system, their obligations to the empire, and the importance of subordinating personal desires to dynastic requirements that would define their entire existence. The succession planning process was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of harem life, because it required mothers to accept that their children's futures would be determined entirely by political considerations, rather than parental love or individual talent and interests. Sons who showed leadership potential might be elevated to positions of power and responsibility, while those who demonstrated independent thinking or questionable loyalty could be marginalized or eliminated as threats to imperial stability. Daughters faced arranged marriages to foreign dignitaries or domestic allies, with their personal happiness sacrificed to diplomatic necessity and political advantage. The retirement planning for aging concubines involved psychological preparation for a transition from political relevance to comfortable irrelevance that required accepting that their value to the imperial system had been entirely based on reproductive potential and sexual attractiveness, rather than individual personality, intelligence, or character. The pension system provided material comfort, but couldn't compensate for the existential crisis of realizing that your entire adult identity had been defined by biological functions and political utility rather than personal achievement or human connection. The institutional memory of the harem system was preserved through oral traditions passed from veteran concubines to newcomers, creating informal educational networks that supplemented official training programs with practical advice about navigating the psychological challenges of life in a system designed to provide luxury while eliminating privacy, autonomy, and authentic human relationships. These informal support systems helped women develop coping strategies that allowed them to maintain mental health and personal dignity within circumstances that seemed designed to destroy individual identity and emotional stability. The cultural impact of harem systems extended far beyond the palaces where they operated, influencing literature, art, and social customs that romanticized arrangements, which were actually forms of institutionalized control, disguised as privilege and luxury. The popular imagination transformed these systems of surveillance and regulation into fantasies of exotic romance and sexual adventure, completely ignoring the psychological costs and human suffering involved in reducing human beings to their reproductive and political utility while eliminating their capacity for genuine choice, authentic relationships, or independent action. The historical documentation of these systems reveals the extent to which bureaucratic thinking could transform intimate human relationships into administrative procedures subject to regulations, monitoring, and quality control measures that treated love, sexuality, and reproduction as industrial processes requiring optimization, standardization, and constant supervision to ensure maximum efficiency in producing desired political outcomes while minimizing security risks and maintaining social stability through the systematic elimination of personal freedom and individual agency in favor of institutional control and dynastic continuity.